A report from Group 17 by Robert C. O'Brien, Chapter 23. What's your first name? Fergus had liked Officer Simon on sight. He had expected to see a camouflage suit. It had been replaced by khaki drill slacks, tan hunting jacket, and brown canvas shoes, yet the dark-tanned face and startlingly light gray eyes were unmistakable now in the early morning mist. Sebastian. Fergus. They shook hands. I know, he smiled. I checked you out, remember? Fergus O'Neill, Ph.D., research biochemist with the Institute for Advanced Biological Studies, Cambridge. You have a good memory. I rechecked the file. I also have information, pretty vague, that you're on assignment to either the State Department or the Army, a consulting job, something to do with biology. I'm not asking questions about it. The plan, Fergus said, is to climb the wall, find out if the girl is in there, and if she is, how to get her out. We can talk on the way. If we start now, we'll still have some daylight. And then some dark, said Officer Simon, which may be more to the point. She's in there all right, or was. We'll need rope. I brought some. The same one you used this morning? You know about that? I was looking around outside the wall. You wore a camouflage suit. Yeah, I decided that was a bad idea. It's government issue, Marine Corps. On this trip, I'm a private citizen. I also don't have my badge. They set out from Fergus's cabin at a brisk walk. The rain continued lightly but steadily. Fergus said, What makes you so sure she's in there? What makes you so sure? Quite a few things, mainly her little brother Willis told me. It was supposed to be a secret between them. I talked it out of him, Officer Simon said. At first, I just had a hunch. I guess the other brother, John, started it, but the more I thought about it, the more I didn't believe that bicycle bit. He was right. It did seem impossible for her to ride through all that mud just by mistake. I met John, said Fergus, and heard his argument. It's pretty convincing. Then I scouted along the wall, Simon continued, and there was a pretty big aspen tree growing near it. Generally, they keep the wall clear of trees, but they missed that one. Aspens grow fast. I figured she could have climbed the tree, that's why she sent her little brother home first, and dropped down the other side. I was still just guessing. But then the next day I saw the tree had been cut down. That was one too many. I climbed over the wall for a look. I grew up in this neighborhood. When I was a kid, we used to fish the river down there. 2 or 3 of us climbed the wall now and then just to see what was in there, the way kids do. So I knew my way around pretty well, but they've added some stuff. A zoo, for one thing. And behind the zoo, with a fence around it, a new building and some pretty funny-looking apparatus. If I ever saw a place that looked like secret keep out, that's it. They're up to something in there. I don't know what. But what I thought was this. The girl, Allison, climbed over the wall right near the building because that's where the tree was. She walked over to it, saw something she shouldn't have seen, and they grabbed her. Then I looked around a little more, and I learned a little more. Maybe they didn't just grab her. Maybe they spotted her and chased her. Down the wall a couple of 100 yards, there's a gate. I know the gate. She must have run for that, hoped she could get out that way, and that's where they caught her. There's a driveway not much used that leads to it. About 10 feet off that, I found signs. Not what you'd call a big fight, more of a scuffle, broken brush. Somebody thrashed around a bit there, and on the ground, in the brush, I found these. He stopped, reached into one of the cavernous pockets of his hunting jacket, and pulled out a small box, held shut with a rubber band. He opened it and shook the contents into his palm. 2 small, bright blue buttons, pathetically feminine, obviously from a shirt, a dress, or sweater. You didn't show these to Mrs. Adam, the mother? No, I thought about it, to tell you the truth. I was afraid she'd break up, and I didn't want to see that. There's something about her that gets you. I know, Fergus said. But I asked her and found out the girl was wearing a blue shirt, and it had buttons on the cuffs. It adds up. It does. He put the buttons back into the box and the box into his pocket. They walked on, approaching the wall through the brush beside the road near where Fergus had found the chipmunks. At first, Officer Simon said, I thought maybe they knocked her out and threw her in the river, then moved the bicycle to make it look like an accident. But I couldn't really believe it. During the war, I was in Marine intelligence. I still am in the reserves. And I worked with the Russians quite a lot up in the Aleutians, joint operations against the Nips. I got to know them pretty well. They like kids. I don't think they'd do that. The bicycle, yes, to fool us, but I think they didn't know what to do with the girl. That's why I'm betting they've still got her in there. waiting for instructions from Moscow. That's what they do. Fergus was thinking. Officer Simon had, with nothing at all to go on, come astonishingly close to the truth. The truth! In actual fact, those two small buttons he had found were the only real evidence that it was the truth. He also thought this was not the time for details about Dr. Schultz and his work. Yet Officer Simon ought to know a bit more, eventually, probably the whole story, so he said, "I know a little about that building. It's a laboratory." "You know, I thought you might." "Why?" "Well, you're a scientist. You suddenly show up in Wilcox's cabin. He's a wheel, or used to be. You're working for state or army intelligence or both. It figures. Again, I'm not asking questions. You'll get the answers anyway, but they're long ones." The wall loomed before them, and Fergus, thinking again of the buttons, felt an excitement and sureness he had not felt before. "Right now, let's leave it at this. The building's a laboratory, and I have good reason to think the girl is in it. Let's go and look." Officer Simon pulled a coil of rope from the game pocket of his hunting coat and knotted a loop at the end. "What's short for Sebastian?" "There isn't any. My friends call me Sim." He firmed up the knot with brown hands. "In school, when I was a kid, they called me Simple Simon. I developed a pretty good left hook, and they shortened it." "Just as well," said Fergus. "The name didn't fit." "Thanks." The rope flew deftly up, and the loop settled over one of the iron spikes. "After you, Sim," said Fergus. "Here's luck." They did not drop from the wall, but lowered themselves silently on the rope, leaving it in place, ready for exit. Inside, under the big trees, the light was dim, and Fergus calculated that up behind the gray rain clouds the sun was not far from setting. Sebastian, Simon, gestured, and they moved toward a grove of still larger trees. Then they turned left, heading away from the gate, toward the laboratory Fergus had never seen. Almost immediately, Simon stopped, caught Fergus's arm, motioned him down. Barely 15 yards ahead of them was a man, walking quickly through the woods. He wore a nondescript dark suit. He had thin gray hair and heavy, thick-lensed spectacles. As they crouched, scarcely breathing, he walked another 10 strides, then turned and started back. At first, it seemed directly at them. No, beyond them, a little to their right. It seemed impossible that he would not see them, but he was intent on the grove just behind them. Had he heard them? Possibly. He peered past them for another moment, turned around, and walked on. He did not pause again. When he was 50 yards away, disappearing among the trees, Simon whispered, He's heading toward the laboratory. Let's watch him." They followed. Simon in the lead, Fergus grateful now for the rain, which made the dead leaves soggy and noiseless underfoot. They had lost sight of him, caught him again, lost him again. Then the woods thinned abruptly and ended, and the man came into full view, striding toward a squat white building with a chest-high fence around it. They stopped, staying in the shadows and out of sight. "There's your laboratory," Simon spoke softly. Off to the right, farther away, stood a long, low barn-like structure, a C-shaped series of sheds, a small pavilion, a few benches. "The zoo," said Simon. He stared straight ahead. "Hold on, look at that." The bespectacled man, having reached the fence, started along it, toward the gate that led through it. Abruptly he stopped and stepped back. Behind him, on the far side of the laboratory building, there was another man working at something they could not quite see. But it was as clear as hide and seek. Man number 1 did not want to be seen by man number 2. He was keeping the building between them. Something else was clear to Fergus. The second man was his monosyllabic friend from the dock. They watched number 2, who was moving forward, backward, crouching, standing purposely, handling something they could not see. Simon reached into another pocket and came out with a small gray-green monocular. Marine Corps property," he said, then focused it on the man working, who would, in another minute, be out of range behind the building. In half that time, Simon handed the glass to Fergus. "What did you say about luck? You're looking at it." Through the glass, which was sharp and astonishingly strong, Fergus saw that the man was holding a strand of shiny copper wire that looked as fine as thread, uncoiling it from a spool in his left hand. Fergus handed the glass back. "I'm not sure what kind of luck." "Bad and good, mostly good. They've turned scary. That's an antenna for an alarm system. That's bad, but the good is that we got here just in time. Now we know it's there. Let's watch where he puts the rest of the wire." Sitting on their heels in the drizzle at the edge of the shadows of the woods, they watched during the next half hour a series of small maneuvers, not at all comprehensible. When the wire man disappeared behind the laboratory, the man with the spectacles rather furtively let himself into the building. Fergus noticed that he took a key from his pocket. The door was locked. 5, perhaps 10 minutes later, the wire man reappeared, having rounded the rear wall. "Now," muttered Simon, "let's see how he closes the circuit. That's what we want to know." Still unreeling wire from the spool, the man threaded it through a low bush, wound it once around a sapling, walked it to the gate, and headed for the laboratory door. "Pretty makeshift," Simon said. "Temporary, but it will work. I've strung them that way myself now and then." "Mainly, I'd say we've lucked out," Fergus said. "Knowing where it is, we won't stumble into it. Knowing where it is, I can deactivate it with scissors, but more important, we know the transmitter's got to be in that building. That means 100 to 1 they don't have anybody guarding it. The receiver will be in somebody's room in the main building. If we're careful." He stopped. Wait, here comes a guest." A small, sallow man carrying an umbrella picked his way gingerly along the wet walkway leading from the villa to the laboratory. "The boss," said Simon. You can tell he's not used to getting his feet wet. The third man paused to inspect and touch with one finger the newly placed antenna, then, with his own key, let himself into the laboratory. A few minutes later, all 3 men re-emerged, accompanied by still a 4th, younger than the others, wearing a white laboratory smock. Together they walked to the gate in the wire fence, where they gathered around something Fergus could not see. Simon had his glass to his eye. "A switch," he said, "fastened behind the gate post. Of course, to turn the alarm off while they're in there. He's showing them how it works." But Fergus was interested in something else. When the 4 came out of the laboratory, he noticed that the man with the thick glasses had also donned a laboratory coat. It came to him with a jolt that the man must be Dr. Schutz. The other was too young. He would be the assistant, the other German. What was his name? Walter. The group separated. The 2 in the white coats re-entered the laboratory. The other 2 turned back toward the zoo and the villa. Fergus was disappointed. This particular scenario was ended. It had provided, as Simon thought, possibly useful information, but it was not what he wanted. He had hoped for something. What? Some indication that the girl was there. True, there were the buttons, yet a nagging worry stirred in his mind, difficult to grasp clearly. "We may as well go," said Simon. "We've seen the show for today." "You mean we give up?" Fergus was incredulous. "Not at all. If you think the girl is in that building, then we've got to get in there. But not now. The alarm system tells us what we need to know. The place is unmanned at night. We could sit here in the rain for 6 or 7 hours. But why should we? I say let's go home for supper, meet again, and come back tonight. Also, I got a pretty good look at the lock on that door through the glass. I'll need a couple of tools to get it open. Can you do it?" "I can." "All right," said Fergus. "Midnight? Let's give them a chance to get to sleep. 1 o'clock. They crept back from the edge of the woods, and as they stood up to walk, the creeping worry in Fergus's mind also stood up and identified itself. It was this. All his thinking, his study of Dr. Schutz's papers, his painstaking piecing together of the Steinkopf research, had produced a clear, to him, picture of what Dr. Schutz was up to. Fergus's primary conclusion, as it pertained to the girl, was that her presence was unknown to the Russians. She and the Steinkopf syndrome were the private possessions of Dr. Schutz. Yet in the last hour he had seen 4 men enter the laboratory, where he thought she must be. That was too many. The young German assistant, yes, it was conceivable, even likely, that he knew about Schutz's plan, or at least about the girl. Perhaps he had to, but the other 2 could hardly enter the building without noticing the presence of a young female prisoner, which meant either of 2 things. Fergus's theory was wrong, or Schutz had the girl hidden away somewhere else, but if not in the laboratory, then where? The worry added to, rather than decreased, his urgent desire to get a look at the inside of the building. Still puzzling, he followed Simon in the gathering dusk through the wet woods toward the grove of big trees, to the right of which stood the wall from which their rope would be hanging. When Jennifer Adam came home from work, Willis was in his room, playing quietly at something or other. Worried, she called up to him. "Willis, yes? How was school?" "It was okay." He sounded quite matter of fact. So he had got through his first day back. She was relieved. That would be the hardest day. What did you do? Reading and numbers. It was rainy, so we couldn't go out. So we played inside and watched the gerbils. He came to the door of his room, but did not come down the stairs. She waited to see if he would say anything about the morning visit from Fergus O'Neill, or what he had told them about Allie, the tree, and the gate. Then she realized that he was waiting to see if she was going to mention it. She felt his apprehension and at once decided that she would not. John was in his room studying, his door shut. Better to let the subject remain dormant, if it would. She said, "I'll call you when supper is ready." Through the day, her own first day back, it had been Willis. Her mind had been busy with the simple work, as it had been Willis's. Her mind had been busy with the simple work of catching up with her job after her absence, a soothingly superficial kind of preoccupation. Now she thought again of her morning's conversation with Dr. O'Neill, Fergus, and it came to her suddenly, as it had not this morning, what a painfully difficult thing he had undertaken to tell her, and how gently, how kindly he had done it. He had said, in effect, to be patient, neither hope nor give up hope, and somehow he had made that seem possible. He had injected a feeling of rationality and strength into her confusion and despair. After he left her, she had felt, for the first time, calm enough to face the thought of going back to work, and had gathered her strength and gone. She wondered again who and what he was. Fergus sounded like a Scottish name, but O'Neill must be Irish. From what he had said, a teacher of some kind, a professor or a scientist, but young, surely not much over 35, her own age. From Cambridge, that would be Harvard or maybe MIT, though not necessarily. There were a dozen research institutions in the area. On a fishing vacation, yet he seemed too serious to be on vacation, staying in the Wilcox cabin on the big estate. Not only Wilcox had been the Undersecretary of State, and was still, so she had heard, in and out of the White House and the State Department. If Fergus was not really on vacation, then what? Was it possible that there was something, that they had some idea that the Russians, for some strange reason... She put the idea out of her head. It was unbelievable, and that was too painful. She kept busy with the dinner and set the table, thinking Willis had stayed in his room since school, a thing he would not have done when Allie was there, and should not do. His routine was broken. All the routines were broken. And they would have to start anew, a second time, building new ones. And that is the end of chapter 23.